then we have questions and answers. And on the first and third Sundays, we have a study class following at 12:30 in the Ocean of Theosophy. This lodge was founded with the idea of universality and brotherhood as the unassailable basis, which theosophists, wherever and however situated in the world, can hold to. This similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching allows all to participate, all to question, all to see themselves as students, no one as the teacher. There is, therefore, this unity allows us to have a lot of flexibility in terms of organization. There's no constitution, bylaws, or officers. The sole bond between associates being this idea of universality and brotherhood. It regards all as theosophists who are engaged in the true service of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes all those to its association who are in accord with these purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to become the better able to help and teach others. Another announcement is that there is an international theosophical conference in New York City taking place August 8th through 11th. And there is a website where one can find this information at Theos, Theos, conf, conf.org, theosconf.org. And there one will find all the information on registration and where to stay and so forth. So the talk for today, the subject of discussion for today is polarity and paradox. And the reading from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10, devotion by means of the universal divine perfections, Krishna is speaking. Neither the assemblage of the gods nor the adept kings know my origin, because I am the origin of all the gods and of the adepts. Whosoever knoweth me to be the mighty ruler of the universe, and without birth or beginning, he among men undiluted shall be liberated from all his sins. Subtle perception, spiritual knowledge, right judgment, patience, truth, self-mastery, pleasure and pain, prosperity and adversity, birth and death, danger and security, fear and equanimity, satisfaction, restraint of body and mind, almsgiving, inoffensiveness, zeal and glory and ignominy, all these, the various dispositions of creatures, come from me. So in former days the 7 great sages and the 4 Manus, who are of my nature, were born of my mind, and from them sprang this world. He who knoweth perfectly this permanence and mystic faculty of mine, become without doubt possessed of unshaken faith. I am the origin of all. All things proceed from me. Believing me to be thus, the wise, gifted with spiritual wisdom, worship me. Their very hearts and minds are in me, enlightening one another and constantly speaking of me. They are full of enjoyment and satisfaction. To them, thus always devoted to me, who worship me with love, I give that mental devotion by which they come to me. For them do I, out of my compassion, standing within their hearts, destroy the darkness which springs from ignorance by the brilliant lamp of spiritual discernment. I establish this whole universe with a single portion of myself, and yet remain separate. And now the talk, Polarity and Paradox.
Friends, thank you. The The subject of today's talk, Polarity and Paradox, is one which hopefully we will see the connection between these two ideas. We'll start with some treatment of these ideas with H.P. Blavatsky's writings, a couple of short quotes, and then we'll expand on that. So from The Secret Doctrine, H.P. Blavatsky characterizes the following as the first fundamental proposition of theosophy. She says, "There is one absolute reality which antecedes all manifested conditioned being. This infinite and eternal cause is the rootless root of all that was, is, or ever shall be. It is devoid of all attributes and is essentially without any relation to manifested finite being. It is Beness rather than being, and is beyond all thought or speculation." She goes on to say, this Beness is symbolized in The Secret Doctrine under two aspects. On the one hand, absolute abstract space, representing bare subjectivity, the one thing which no human mind can either exclude from any conception or conceive of by itself. On the other hand, absolute abstract motion, representing unconditioned consciousness. Consciousness is inconceivable apart from change, and motion best symbolizes change, its essential characteristic. Even before that, in The Secret Doctrine, she talks about parabrahm, this Sanskrit word that helps us to bridge the gap between our Western language and its limitations and this idea of the absolute. She says, parabrahm is simply, as a secondless reality, the all-inclusive cosmos, or rather, the infinite cosmic space, in the highest spiritual sense. She says, parabrahm is the collective aggregate of cosmos in its infinity and eternity. The that and this to which distributive aggregates cannot be applied. So we need to understand what this idea of the infinite is. What does infinity mean? What is the role of the infinite in the formation of the universe? What's the role in our lives? We need to understand our own infinite nature. We tend to think of the infinite as something abstract, something out there, something beyond, something past the edge of space, something out of reach. What we'll discuss today hopefully will demonstrate that a clearer understanding of the infinite and an appreciation for it, and how deeply and inextricably connected we are to the infinite. The infinite is, in fact, a part of our lives, a part of the manifested world. And we'll go through some conceptual stages that hopefully will illustrate this idea better. We often hear that we are all one, that our higher nature connects us to each other and to the one self of all. This is a fundamental aspect of the theosophical philosophy. We extend this concept even further and talk about being rays from the invisible source of all, one with the absolute, this first fundamental that we just talked about, that we are simply reflections of the eternal, and all this is true. It will be presented here today that the infinite is not just out there, but right here, in the material world. We can touch it, and we can manipulate it, and we use it. In fact, we rely on it for everything we do and everything that we are. But what it means to be infinite, we sort of need to talk about how things came to be, what it means to be part of a universe that is in constant motion, part of the endless transformation of matter into energy. Last week we learned about fire and the Buddha's fire sermon. He says that the manifested world is perpetually on fire. He calls this ceaseless dissolution. If we think about this ongoing, perpetual dissolution, this motion, this activity, and think about the absolute and contrast these ideas, we can focus on two words. Dissolution itself means dissolving, means its component or constituent parts, or as she says, the distributive aggregates, when she defines Parabrahm. These distributive aggregates can be broken down, they can be dissolved. It literally means to cut in two, dissolve. If we consider the word absolute, it has the same root, solute, absolve. Ab meaning without or not. So the absolute really is, can't be broken down. It has no constituent parts. So not only is the manifest world dissolvable, but it is in constant, ceaseless state of dissolution. The absolute is that aspect that it isn't even an aspect. It is that primordial concept of can't be dissolved. So that just draws that distinction. There is a paradox in there, and that is the polarity. But we need to take it further. This can be summarized by saying that there's the origins of how things come about can be summarized by saying that there's an impulse from the absolute itself, the origins of which are mysterious and obscure, and would require really a whole talk to introduce and a lifetime to understand. But suffice it to say for now that there is a first cause. It's an impulse to manifest, and this manifestation is first seen in the form of polarity. The one becomes dual. This is still pre-cosmic. It's still just the dawning of what we call objective reality. There is no human, there's no Earth, there's no solar system or Milky Way or multitude of galaxies, no universe, no multiverse. These things do not exist as we understand them right now. There's not even dimension or physicality of any kind at this first stage of polarization. But polarity is all that's required to label the state of existence. We go from 0 to 1. We have this binary, this positive and negative, this day and night. It is only through these pairs of opposites that we can have anything that can be measurable. There can be no motion through undifferentiated space without a point A and a point B, without a here and a there. This polarity is what gives character to manifestation. Getting down to the level of the human state is a series of this process unfolding again and again. We do not lose that pattern. The same impulse to manifest is continuous from each plane onto the next plane. There's this process, comes from those mysterious origins down to us, to you and to I. Everyone, every incarnation of every single creature that has ever lived, all have their origin in that first cause. The same principles apply at each level as they unfold. When we conceive of the polarity that characterized that first manifestation, we're really seeing the same polarity that characterizes everything in manifestation now, everything in the material world, down to the most inconsequential minutiae. In the philosophy, we're told that when babies are born, they're in a state of consciousness that is just one small degree separated from the Atman, separated from the Absolute. They're born with an already fading sense of oneness with all, which is, and a growing conception that replaces it of being distinct from others. So they repeat this process, even just in birth, coming from an absolute sort of conditionless state into this process of self-awareness. It's an illusion, ultimately, but it is the characteristic nature that there is an us and there is an other. If he's fortunate, if this child is fortunate, he or she will be told that the absolute is them, that they are the absolute, that she comes from that. He may even be told that thou art, if they're fortunate, as we have been fortunate to learn from the philosophy. But even this language conveys that separation. It underscores that conditioned state of manifestation, because the statement is not this thou art, as though we are that. It is that thou art. You know, there's this distinction, as HPB says in that definition of Parabrahm. It is the collective aggregate of cosmos in its infinity and eternity, the that and this to which distributive aggregates cannot be applied. So we're in this world of that and this when we're born into a body. And there's that polarity again, the distinction between this and that, between here and now and there and then. Mathematics has this covered. There is the me, the one, and then there is the you, the two. So there is an implicit separation of these two things. Separation between one and two. They're obviously not the same thing. And for all practical purposes can never be the same thing, neither mathematically nor personally. One's body and mind, hopes, dreams, etc., will never be exactly the same as another's hopes and dreams and body. We're all like snowflakes. That's a characteristic of this manifested world, where everyone is unique. And unique in an absolute and infinite way, in fact. But this apparent separation can help us to understand what HPB means when she says that beingness is symbolized by space and motion. We cannot conceptualize other except in terms of distance, in terms of a separating space between us and the other. We cannot conceive of reaching the other person or the other state without motion to take us from here to there. There's that motion involved. Even if we're not talking about physical distance, even just perceptive distance, to hear the other person, sound waves need to travel. The energy needs to move from one place to another. If it didn't, there would be no perception happening there. To see the other, there has to be light waves traveling through space. And that's what makes the person visible. Our entire perception of reality is based on this motion, or as HPB calls it, consciousness, through space, or as HPB calls it, the subjective unmanifest. Either one on its own is incognizable. Motion without space has no real meaning, and space without motion, there's nothing manifest. And it forms the basis of everything we see and do with these bodies and these minds. At a subtle, more subtle and arguably more real level, the very atoms that comprise the universe are characterized by these same ideas of constant motion through subjective space. Subjective in the sense that we don't see the space in this material world. I mean, it's subatomic, so it's the interstitial space between atoms, which is far vaster than what the atoms themselves make up, and yet it seems solid, but it is in constant motion. It is because of its motion that it is solid. So this is that paradox again. So how is this motion through space possible? We learn about Fohat, which is the cosmic electric force that transforms will into action. But if we think about how different 1 and 2 are, how can we really traverse the distance between 1 and 2? At what point can we actually say that one has reached the other, or do they ever meet? Or is there always this separation between 1 and 2? If we look at this mathematically, the purest form of reason becomes available to us. Mathematics is reliable. It's universal. It works for every point of manifestation. But we very quickly encounter Zeno's paradox. This is the problem that there's an infinite divide between 1 and 2, or between here and there. Zeno created this thought experiment and said that if we were to shoot an arrow at a target, it can never actually reach the target because it must traverse half the distance between the person firing the arrow and the distance, the wall or the target on the other side. Once it reaches that halfway point, it then has a remaining distance, which it also has to, at some point, pass through the halfway point. And once it reaches that halfway point of the remaining distance, before it can get to the target, it has to reach the halfway point of the remaining distance. And you can see how we can do this forever. The arrow will always have some distance remaining that can be cut in half. And it has to traverse that halfway point, because it can't somehow vaporize from space and reappear somewhere past that halfway point, right? There's always going to be another halfway point. So the arrow can never actually reach the wall. In other words, we can never actually do anything. This is the paradox, because we know the arrow does reach the wall. It's obvious. It seems ridiculous to even think of why wouldn't the arrow reach the wall. And yet the math is clear. There is an infinite number of divisions of space. How can an arrow traverse this infinite number of divisions? Mathematically, we would show this as, between 1 and 2, it would be 1, 1 and a half, 1 and 3/4, 1 and an eighth, or 1 and 7/8, etc. And there's just an infinite number of fractions in between. We can see something similar happening with pi. The ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter. This is just, it's just a number, right? 3.14159, etc. But that number goes on forever. We never can, in an absolute way, determine that value. We can try and calculate it, but it's an irrational number. It cannot be represented by a whole number fraction over a whole number. And this is just something as simple as the circumference of a circle. How big around something is to how wide it is. It's 3.14159, and it just goes on forever. And we say that lightly, as though the infinite is somehow, it's just there. But it's there between two other things, right? We can never actually end this pursuit, because there'll always be one more number we can get to. In that delta between how wide a circle is and how big around it is this infinite series of numbers that by definition never repeat. So if you took a photograph of a sunset with a digital camera, you have a digital representation of that scene. A digital representation means literally it is represented by digits. It's represented by numbers. It's a big number, to be sure, thousands of digits perhaps, but pi eats big numbers for breakfast. It's infinite, right? So somewhere in that sequence is going to be that sunset. If we were to take a picture of anything, it could be characterized that way. It exists within pi. If you doing research for the talk, The Secret Doctrine, I used a digital version of The Secret Doctrine. That's the entire book, all the pictures, all the footnotes, every word, every text, in there is digital. It's a number. It's a single number. A very, very, very big, big, big number. But the entire thing exists within pi. At some point in an infinite series of random digits, that sequence is going to appear. That's the nature of the infinite. It exists in there somewhere. If you could accurately measure the state and direction, the position of and energy level and all other qualities and characteristics of every atom in your body, that would be a number. It would be translatable into a single, very, very long number, series of digits. That exists within pi. So everything that you are, everything everywhere, this is what we need to understand about infinity, is that it contains all. It contains all in a very real way. And pi is not the only number that does this. There are there's an infinite number of irrational numbers, an infinite number of infinite sequences of numbers. So the mind reels when trying to take this all in, but it's important to try to grasp how vast the potential is for this concept of infinity and how important it is to our daily lives. The existence of everything within pi, again, is kind of just a mathematical trick. But you can, in small ways, even see this. There's a computer, there's a website that has the first 4 million digits of pi. I mean, that's a lot of digits. And you can search for your birthday, for example. Anything digital, any sequence of numbers, you can just do a search. And it will tell you that, for example, in my case, the dates of my birth appear around the 2 millionth digit of pi. You know, it might not have appeared within those first 4 million, but it does. And you can put any number in there. And if you continue to, it just illustrates the point that if you continue to expand how many digits you have, you can find any sequence of numbers. And again, it's important to remember that all of this exists between 3.1 and 3.2. It's 3.14 something, right? All of this exists between the number 3 and the number 4. It all exists between how big around a circle is and how wide it is. So it's just like the distance between Zeno's arrow in motion. As it gets closer to the wall, you know, it does eventually hit the wall. How does it do this? It's because the infinite is embedded in manifestation. We are constantly transcending the infinite. It makes manifestation possible. It's not just out there in space or beyond some imagined edge of the universe kind of thing. It's not only everywhere in everything, but it's required for us to function. It's our legacy from the absolute. The absolute is still the absolute, even during a manifestation. It doesn't disappear. It embeds everything. It's how we can get that arrow to reach the wall. We could not have gotten to this room today were it not for our ability to transcend the infinite. Every step we take, every blink of an eye, is an exercise in embracing and engaging the infinite. This is covered by the concept of quantum superposition and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. We can know the position of an atom but not its direction, or we can know its direction but not its position. The observation of it is what solidifies it. It's what makes it manifest. We are already in both places. We are already the one and the two. Our consciousness or our awareness, our own observation establishes our position as the one or the two. But in reality, there is no separation. We are the absolute. And we are the absolute because we come from it, and it permeates everything that we are, everywhere we are. We can rely on mathematics to describe the manifested world around us, and mathematicians are constantly discovering new ways to understand this world's infinite complexities. But in the end, we're not constrained by numbers. We can get from 1 to 2, and we pass easily and effortlessly through this infinity with every step. In doing so, we realize that this and that really are the same. This thou art. To conclude, I'm just going to read a couple more quotes from The Secret Doctrine to help underscore some of this. HPV says, space is the real world, while our world is an artificial one. Space is the one unity throughout its infinitude, in its bottomless depths as on its elusive surface, a surface studded with countless phenomenal universes, systems, and mirage-like worlds. Nevertheless, the real world is a unity of forces. And she says, though one and the same thing in their origin, spirit and matter, when once they are on the plane of differentiation, being each of them their evolutionary progress, begin each of them their evolutionary progress in contrary directions. Spirit falling gradually into matter, and the latter ascending to its original condition, that of a pure spiritual substance. Both are inseparable, yet ever separated. In polarity, on the physical plane, two like poles will always repel each other, while the negative and the positive are mutually attracted. So do spirit and matter stand to each other, the two poles of the same homogeneous substance, the root principle of the universe. She says, they see, moreover, in these two opposite forces only two aspects of the universal unit called manifesting mind, in which aspects occultism, through its great seers, perceive an innumerable host of operative beings, cosmic Dhyan-chohans, entities whose existence in its dual nature is the cause of all terrestrial phenomena. For that essence is co-substantial with the universal electric ocean, which is life, and being dual, as said, positive and negative. It is the emanations of that duality that act now on earth under the name of modes of motion. Even force now become objectionable as a word, for fear it should lead someone, even in thought, to separate it from matter. It is, as occultism says, the dual effects of that dual essence, which have now been called centripetal and centrifugal forces, negative and positive poles, or polarity, heat and cold, light and darkness, etc., etc. So with that, we'll open it for questions or comments.
First question is, you made reference to the existence of Dhyan-chohans as being essential, lack of better term, players in the terrestrial manifestations. Could you elaborate on that, or clarify that, or
well,
say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Dhyan-chohans are the part of sort of the cosmic hierarchy of manifestation, where they exist as sort of great teacher creators and play their role within the formation of the universe and with its maintenance and perpetuation, part of the plan of manifestation, if you will. They're also mentioned in the context of Fohat and that sort of divine electric will power that translates impulse into action. Discussing the entire background of the Dhyan-chohans is out of the scope of what I'm presenting here today, but if anyone else has anything to add, it would be appreciated. Please.
They're also connected with our world, physical world, because in the secret doctrine, HPB says that the Chohanic Diane Chohans give us our spiritual and psychical nature, and our individuality comes from the Buddhas. So they're all connected, and as you said, they're teachers and cosmocrators, which are the builders of our universe, but they're not separate from it. If, when we talk about the continuum that you just established here, our principles come from them, then we're connected to them, aren't we? But we don't really think about it. We think that we're separate from them. And that is the cause of all this mischief in the universe, I think. So when we think of them, we have to think of them as part of us. And somewhere in there it says that we are their human family, and that they watch over us and guide us towards that time when our consciousness will be enlarged to perceive internally who and what we are, and be initiated into becoming workers in that voice of the army, or army of the voice, whichever you want to say, as foot soldiers to start with. And this is the brotherhood of the masters that we're emulating to join, obviously. And as we become perfected and our range of consciousness enlarges, and we can become better supporters of the universal scheme in the perfectibility of the human soul.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful characterization of the Dion Chohans. Another question, comment?
The significance of the circumference of the circle and the diameter, is that what we're talking about, is the ratio between them?
That is pi.
That is pi. Can you explain pi a little bit, refresh my understanding?
Well, it really is very simple. It is just that difference, or you know, the circumference is always going to be bigger, right? Because it goes around the diameter. The diameter is straight through. So when you take the circumference and you put that number in a fraction and divide it by the diameter, what you get is pi.
It's pi, right?
3.1415.
Right.
So there's always been this sort of give and take, this back and forth between coming up with an accurate definition of pi, so that with one of the other numbers we could calculate the other. So if we have the diameter of a circle and pi, we can figure out the circumference. If we have the circumference of a circle and pi, we can figure out the diameter. This is just very useful in geometry and mathematics.
Yeah, we were in high school.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you have an exact value for the circumference and you have an exact value for the diameter, you can get pi. So it's just it's algebra, figure what filling in the missing piece. What's the variable, solving for x in that sense. It all comes down to how accurately we can scientifically measure these things. I mean, we have lasers that can measure the diameter of a iridium sphere, right? But it can only, even at the measurement of wavelengths of light, we can only measure that to maybe a few hundred digits of pi. And yet, there's this sort of, if there's a mountain, we will climb it kind of attitude towards pi, that we have these teams of people, mathematicians, trying to push the limit of how many digits of pi we've calculated. We've calculated digits of pi into the trillions.
Well,
and it's, the necessity for that in all practical purposes is absolutely absurd. There's no scientific application we can make of that. We don't have instruments that that sensitive to make measurements of that kind. It's purely abstract math.
Well, the follow-up to that is, then you are saying, or you did say, that then pi explains mathematically the infinite.
Well, it's only one representation. As I said,
Why isn't that enough?
Well,
It's only one. I mean, but you're saying it is a representation.
It
but
is.
Only
It is.
means what? I don't get.
Well, only one meaning. You could take the square root of 2,
Okay.
for example.
Okay.
That's another irrational number. That is, it has a decimal that never repeats. It just, you keep calculating it more and more accurately, you get another number, and it is random.
So that's further evidence of the infinite.
Right.
That mathematically the infinite.
Well, there are an infinite number of irrational numbers between 0 and 1.
Right.
And each of those irrational numbers is itself infinite.
So that means that there's unlimited possibilities.
Right.
In all things.
The idea here is that infinity is not a number.
No.
There's no such thing as infinitely big,
Yeah. But
right? Just like there's no such thing as infinitely small. Because otherwise, where does 0 fit in there? I mean, isn't infinitely small the same as 0?
well,
If it's infinitely small, it means it's something greater than 0 because you're using the concept of infinity for it. So there's an infinitely big, of course, it just continues to go out. And that's just how our consciousness tends to conceptualize it, that it's just, well, just add 1, and then add 1 again, and then plus a tenth, plus 1/1,000,000th, plus a fraction, a billionth. It's always something you can add. So there's no end point at which you can say, that's it, that's the number, that's infinite. It just doesn't happen.
Did I understand you correctly to say that infinity was the outer ring of space and substance?
No, that's how we tend to picture it, but it really isn't that.
Okay.
And the evidence that it isn't that is the
Yeah.
fact that it's right there between 3.14 and 3.15.
Thank you.
Sure.
If you can please put the circle with its diameter. Thank you. There you go.
So this is the diameter, and this is the circumference.
And then can you put from the center of that array downward? Yeah.
Or do you want it downward?
Yeah, that's fine. That's
No.
fine. That's perfect. Thank you. Anywhere is good. Okay. Now,
This is the radius.
mathematically, we can represent it as explained. But from the soul perspective, let us look at that ray, because Kathy gave a talk where she discussed fire and the centrifugal and the centripetal forces. And when you go to the center of that circle, that energy is coming from center out. And if you go to the periphery and move it inward towards the center, that's the centripetal force going in. Those two forces are what retains the universe intact.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the human being, the exact same thing happens. We have energy that comes from the core out, that's the soul energy coming out. And what does it enable us to do? Perceive. We have senses that enable us to perceive the universe. What about the periphery in? Information is coming in from the universe, and we're going to translate that to a mathematical formula to understand it. When you put the mind in it, it understands metaphysics as well as mathematics, but the metaphysics has its root in mathematics, as you just explained. So this is the soul nature expressed with that formula there. This is our working in the universe from the soul's perspective.
Thank you. In the back.
Based on what you've discussed and the comments and questions afterward, we're using our minds to think of it, but in practical terms, how can one embrace infinity as a part of one's nature? How can one come closer to a sort of comfortableness with the idea of infinity? and apply it in our daily lives? What could it mean for the betterment of humanity?
Well, good question. Good question. To this student, the importance of this idea is inherent in the fact that we are all connected. As we opened the talk, we're told this, that we're all one, and yet how do we really see that in manifestation when we see I'm here, that person is there. We don't look anything alike. We don't think alike. You know, we're different. Everybody's different. This idea that we are actually both ourselves and that person at the same time, because the arrow can hit the wall, because we do transcend the distance between the two things that seem impossible to transcend. You know, understanding that the infinite is not this vast, incalculable thing. It is something that exists right here and now that we can transcend and move through effortlessly. Allows us to it just allows us to see that unity, which is really the basis of all ethical progress. It's the basis of all spiritual, ethical, moral, condition. So with understanding that just like the this and the that are the same thing and come from the same source, we are just rays, we are just reflections. Bringing it back to that source is the ultimate ethical corollary to the metaphysical point. So, back in the back row, she has a follow-up.
I guess just what occurred to this student was that not only should we think we are the other, but also we are everything that we think of as out there. We're the universe, we're expanding, we're one, and that it seems like that idea could bring us closer to the idea of those who have solved these mysteries of life, the adepts, the Mahatmas, the initiates, the gurus, the Dian Chohans, that we aren't separate from them, and maybe just reminding ourselves is a first step to embracing it, and it seems that higher states of consciousness would probably bring that about, bring that as the Gita said, that unshaken faith and belief, true, home, that we would really experience it, we would realize it, not just think about it.
Thank you. Yeah. I think it was in the 1700s. William Blake said, the universe in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour. It's the same idea that they're embedded in there. We're not limited in that way.
Could I have a follow-up to the student's question or comment just now? This student has always thought it struck me that the adepts, we've always thought of them as perfect and so forth. But by your analogy, just applying that to perfectibility, is there any such thing as perfectibility? It seems like we are in a continuous pattern of growth even after we become perfected. And the adepts there are in the process too of getting closer and closer to the all.
Yeah, well, let's just analyze the ideas of perfection and perfectibility first. Your question relates to, are the adepts ever considered to be perfect or perfected? Are they still on a path? Did they get closer and closer to perfection? Well, there's also this idea of perfectionism and perfectibility and perfection. One cannot engage in the minutiae of the everyday life in a way that is sort of ego-based in order to achieve perfection. That's perfectionism, and that's perhaps a vice of a kind because of its basis in the ego. But the process of perfectibility, with the emphasis on that word process, is what we are all engaged in all the time, to varying degrees of awareness. It is part of the evolution. You know, we, upon the lighting up of mind, are gifted with self-induced and self-devised behavior. So we can engage consciously at this point. Don't always, but we can engage consciously in that process of perfection. But there's never a final end state that we would call perfected. We use the term in a perhaps casual way. We call, the adepts, the perfected ones. But there's, they are themselves on a scale, a continuum of perfectibility. So yes, we all do get closer and closer to perfection, closer and closer to a realization of the all. At what point we can say that we've achieved that, it is all still relative. I mean, it's as long as we are talking about what's happening within manifestation, it's still relative. So I think there's some follow-up back there.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Right now, it's a lot of spiritual teachers in the States who are teaching non-polarity. And they're saying there is no light, there is no darkness, it's all the same, it all came from the same source. And it's very popular. I met a lot of people who are saying, no, we are not looking into negative things because it's all positive things and it's all good. And our teachings are saying that there are dark forces and there are light forces, and it's a struggle. And looking at life of HPB, we see how it's Catholic Church, for her thinking, jumped on her, and how scientists jumped on her, and she died actually because of this ignorant forces fight her. So I'm thinking, and these dark forces, do they come from light, or where did they come from? And how to deal with this Americans who want to look only into good, and they don't want to even discuss. Right now, when I say, climate change, they say, don't talk about climate change, because when you talk, you create more of the climate change. And I'm thinking, but if we don't talk and then don't look, so it's denial. So, but I'm thinking about this all the time, about this polarity and non-polarity, and of course we are all absolute, but how to deal in the real life with this?
Well, that's a great question. Look at that, we're out of time. No, seriously, yeah. There's a lot to that, and it's something that would really require a whole talk or lifetime of study. But
an infinite number of talks.
Yes, an infinite number of talks. But there's some really fundamental ideas there that I'd like to address. One is that we can say that we're all one and deny this concept of polarity, the concept of light and dark, of hot and cold, of good and evil. We can deny those, but that doesn't make them go away. Those are practical realities that we do have to deal with on a daily basis. Hopefully, our consciousness is based in the higher nature, and so it can perceive the comings and goings of that heat and cold, that pleasure and pain, and we rise above those pairs of opposites. That doesn't mean a denial of the practical exigencies of the day. I mean, we still need to adjust the temperature of the faucet so that we aren't scalded by the hot water, right? It seems somewhat nihilistic to simply deny the polarity of the manifested world. We're here, and we're here for a reason. We're here to learn from it, and it can be, we can struggle against it through a denial of it, or we can even struggle against it just chafing at all the negative things that are going on, or we can try and just root our consciousness as high as possible. The higher we root our consciousness, the further we are from being affected by it in a way that is painful or pleasurable. it's both a beautiful and ugly world, and we can focus on either aspect of that. But to deny one or the other is to no one's benefit in the student's understanding. At the same time, we are what theosophy is called reality assigning agents. So there is some truth to the idea that if we talk about climate change, that we are reinforcing climate change. It becomes elemental. There are real forces at work there between our thoughts and the reality around us. So the emphasis should not be on denying climate change or ignoring it for this, so that we don't make the problem worse, but to do what we feel drawn to do. If an individual feels that they have something to contribute to the climate change problem, if that feels attractive to them, then they should follow that. And because the universe is going to guide them, their karma, their the infinite lives behind them are guiding them to this moment, which allows them to decide what to do with that moment. And if solving climate change is something someone feels strongly about, then they should move in that direction. We shouldn't, if we're not inclined to solve climate change, if the whole idea just scares us, then we don't need to deny it, but we don't need to lament about it either. We simply allow those who are attracted to the problem to deal with it. And if it comes up in conversation, just say, I'm very grateful for those people who are taking this on as their issue. It isn't negative for them. It's positive for them. It's a challenge. It's a problem to be solved, and that's a good thing. But for us to mourn over climate change is really just precipitating negative elementals in some way, and it probably doesn't help. Again, not to deny it, but
to say that the problem exists, is it negative or not?
Well, if we're saying it and our consciousness is really firmly rooted in the higher nature, which is dispassionate, we are not creating the reality. It is not harmful to identify the problem. I mean, there's a trend among sort of New Age psychology to say that we should always be thinking in terms of abundance. Now, these same people are always recycling and talking about the scarcity of our natural resources. There tends to be that within this liberal thought cycle. So reconciling those two things is about understanding that recycling is not because of the scarcity of natural resources necessarily, but it's rather because of an appreciation and a recognition of the immense value that the natural world provides to us. And in honoring that, we don't just waste it. We recycle it because it's the right thing to do, not because we're going to run out of something, right? And by emphasizing, but it's the same act, putting the bottle in the recycle bin, but there's a positive way to make that act, and it promotes, because appreciation begets the thing we appreciate. So it promotes an abundance of resources. And recycling in a negative way because of the scarcity, then we're promoting scarcity. So same act, it's just the thought behind it that changes what really happens, what goes out.
And one more question I asked you, the dark forces, were they created by the light forces to help them, to train us better, or they are just coming from another source?
Well, I don't have the quote here, but I did come across it in The Secret Doctrine. She uses the word evil, and she contrasts it with good, and she says that they really come out of the absolute in the same way that all other polarity does, in the same way that hot and cold, fire and water, earth and air, all these these opposites come from manifestation, including good and evil. And those are also pairs of opposites that we have to rise above. The difference may be that good tends to be more sustainable. What we label good, that is structures that are inherently stable, we call those good. And structures that are inherently that tend to dissolve towards disunity, those are inherently bad, or those are what we label bad. There is no inherent good or bad in those things. It's certainly we take advantage of the dark forces in a way, because we do learn from them. And they do provide, the experience of our karma that we need to experience. But ultimately, it all resolves back into the absolute at the end of the Manvantara.
But there is one point I would like to bring to everybody's attention is that which point are we looking at the subject from? Because in the Gita, Krishna says he is perfect. So that soul, the spiritual essence in us, is also perfect. Only the lower aspect of man is imperfect, that is trying to achieve this perfectibility.
Agreed. Which is why we try to emphasize being as high as possible in terms of where we base our consciousness, base our actions in the higher nature, because that is where we are closest to perfection, and positive results will ensue.
Well, that's who we are.
That's who we are.
This,
Yes.
we are that.
That thou art. Okay.
We are that. As long as we identify with the lower, we're not identifying with the higher.
Well, the objective of perfection seems to be the point.
It's a goal. I mean, the infinite is perfect, right? I mean,
I'm
that's
talking about man's journey.
right. But
I mean,
man's
if all of what you say is true today, and it is, okay, then the journey of man has to have a purpose. Okay. Now, this came up yesterday at the conference. The question that came to my mind after sitting through the afternoon session was that, the three aspects of time: past, present, and future. Within it, the history of and geography of the world cycle repeats itself.
okay.
And if that's the case, and if we accept this idea of the golden age and the silver age and Kali Yuga and all that, then and we accept the fact that that repeats itself, then what is the point?
Well, it repeats itself not in a circle, but in a spiral. It repeats itself, like this.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have Kali Yuga here, and you have Kali Yuga here. So we're experiencing it again, but we have that experience carries forth to that point. You know what I mean? We know now more than we did then. We're not
So you're
experiencing
saying-
it with the
okay,
same
so
level of
by
ignorance.
virtue of the
This is
spiral,
increasing perfection.
increasing
perfectibility.
Okay, inherent,
Experience.
The P factor.
inherently.
Right.
Okay. All right.
But you're also gaining experience.
But now, okay, given that, then it seems to me that the point for man would be perfection. What else is, if we're going to have trials and tribulations on, and we're going to keep getting better and better and better and better, okay, there's got to be a point.
Right.
All right.
Well,
this
it's
process,
all.
this journey, this pilgrimage. Okay.
But it's about the journey, not the destination, right?
Well,
The
in a sense, yes, but from an analytical standpoint, it has to have a reason. There's got to be a point to this. This is not, all this cannot be for haphazard reasons.
Right.
Okay?
There's no.
It is clear that there's a point.
Yeah, there is a point.
There's an inherent logic to this.
There is.
For
Yeah,
man,
we
I'm
have
not
to
talking about the whole piece. I'm talking about for man, our daily living.
Okay, we get your point. I want to hear what
It
her.
was just a quick comment. We live in this world of analytical stuff and so forth. I think the point is we need to remember and rise above all that to the perfect, to the higher self. Whereas the higher self is very suppressed in this age of materialism right now. So the whole objective is to get us to understand, this student's view anyway, that there is that higher nature. That higher nature is perfect. And we may never get it together, but we have to suppress that lower nature to the point where it is subservient to the higher, which is the reverse of what it
Not
is today.
suppress it. We need to empower it to
Empower it.
to
Okay,
provide
empower. That's a better word.
support to the higher nature.
I
I mean,
agree with
the
you.
thing is, we come from perfection, right? The absolute is perfect. It didn't need to manifest, right? So this whole process is part of its perfection. Everything is exactly the way it should be. There is no error anywhere in the universe, right? So we're just engaged in this process for reasons we do not understand. I mean, I can't, from this podium, nor can any of these books actually illuminate that first cause's reason. We don't know. That's why I say in the beginning, it's shrouded in mystery. And HBB reinforces this. We don't have any way, ratiocinatively, with our minds, to conceptualize that first cause. We don't know what the impulse was. The desire first arose in it, is all we're told, and that's not that useful in terms of actually understanding what this whole journey is about. At some point, we kind of have to relinquish it to the higher states of consciousness that we achieve, hopefully, in meditation, right? It's not going to be something that we can actually answer. We came from perfection, and we will return to perfection, and we're going to be perfect the whole time. We can't be otherwise. That's why I say it's the process of perfectibility. It's a journey, like you said. The journey of man is this continual realizations, but those realizations are not something we acquire or we strive to achieve. Those happen because we already are that. Those happen because we shed the veils that are obscuring those things, obscuring our perception or realization of those things. So it's more a process of revealing and awakening than it is a process of gaining and acquiring.
Very well said.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.